Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and today we are bringing back the Q&A format. Today I'm doing a Q&A specifically on the Falkland Islands, as the Argentines still call them today, the Islas Malvinas, both the islands themselves and the 1982 war there. So this Q&A comes about because I just got back from about a 10-day trip to the islands. I was there primarily to do a recreation of the Great Yomp, with two buddies, Les Winner from Polaris Logistics and Jari Laine from Varusteleka. We had a really good time. It was a painful time and it was a bit of a slog, but we covered about 60 miles from Port San Carlos on the west of East Falkland to Port Stanley on the east of East Falkland, following the route of 4-5 Commando in 1982. Very cool, very interesting experience. Then we got to take some time to go up onto some of the battlefields. We spent some time with the FIDF, the Falkland Islands Defense Force, and we also got to see some penguins. And speaking of penguins, one of the things we did along the way was come up with the idea of penguin brutality, which eventually led to this cool bit of artwork, which we decided would look awesome as a t-shirt and patch. So they arrived too late for me to film the actual Q&A with one, but they are now available in stock and shipping from Varusteleka. So if you think the concept is cool, if you think the art's cool, or if you just want to see a cute little penguin with an L1A1 SLR, check out the link in the description below. Anyway, I figured I should do a Q&A to answer various questions about the islands and the war. These questions all come from the fantastic folks on Patreon who help make Forgotten Weapons possible. I'm planning to continue doing these Q&As. I did them for a long time back when, and there's been a drop-off. I haven't done them in a while, and I think it's about time to bring them back. So if you would like to submit a question to the next Q&A, sign up on Patreon. And when I'm setting up the Q&A, I will post a request there for relevant questions. Anyway, let's dig into the ones we have for today. We're going to start with James, who says, the FAL was used on both sides. How did it perform in the war? And how heavy did it feel on those long marches across the island? First off, as far as I can tell from all the veteran accounts and everything, the FALs performed very well. Nobody really talks about having problems with their rifles, either the Argentines or the British. They are essentially the same rifle, although the British always, they referred to their own rifles as SLRs. It was the L1A1 self-loading rifle, SLR, in British service. An inch pattern FAL is how we usually refer to those in the US. The Argentines had metric pattern FALs, an initial batch that were purchased from FN, and then they had licensed production in Argentina. The British troops referred to the Argentine rifles as FNs. The Argentine rifles were select fire, and they also had both fixed and folding stock models. The British SLRs were semi-auto only, and all had fixed stocks to them. As far as their weight on the marches, I really think the rifle was kind of one of the least important elements of weight. The guys doing those Yomps. Yomp, by the way, is British Marine slang for your own marching pace. The paras did tabs, which was tactical advance to battle. They're both just slang terms for walking. But they had a lot of other stuff that they were carrying, primarily ammunition and heavy weapons ammunition. So both sides used FN mags. The British had Milan missiles. They had Carl Gustaf rocket launchers. They had M72 Law rocket launchers. They had ammunition for all of those things, plus ammo for their own rifles, plus everything else that was in their Bergens, tents, ground pads, food. The rifle was not a trivial portion of that, but it wasn't that big a deal. And the difference in weight between the FAL and any other rifle that might have been, say, 2 pounds lighter was not particularly significant in this case. Second question comes from a different James. Says, my understanding is that light weapons like the FAL, the FN MAG, and portable anti-tank rockets did okay despite rough conditions, and anti-aircraft cannons in ground rolls were effective, but some bigger weapons like the British Rapier and blowpipe anti-aircraft missiles were less effective than hoped. Were lessons learned from this? Yeah, definitely. The British anti-aircraft missile systems were significantly underperformed. They did not do all that well. Blowpipe was basically, I think there was one aircraft shot down by a blowpipe. That was it. Rapier was not nearly as effective as anticipated. Part of these issues were things like the Rapier battery at San Carlos was set up on the top of the hill, and it wasn't uncommon for Argentine jets to actually come in below the altitude of the missile battery itself, which caused some issues. Neither of those systems performed the way they were hoped to. The Sea Dart missiles were also significant underperformers. But yes, the light weapons all worked really quite well for both sides. The British had FALs, they had FN mags, they called these SLRs and GPMGs. They had the Milan anti-tank missile, which was extremely effective, and British use of the Milan, it's a wire-guided missile with about a 2-kilometer range intended for shooting at tanks. And it's wire-guided, so the gunner puts his crosshair on the target, you fire the missile, and you keep the crosshair on the target as the missile flies, which allows you to track a moving target. It was a quite accurate system. The Argentines had some French Panhard armored cars that never left Stanley. In combat, the British ended up realizing that they could use these Milan missiles on emplaced Argentine heavy weapons, recoilless rifles, GPMGs, Browning M2 machine guns, and they were extremely effective in that role. The Falklands have almost no trees, very little ground cover. You could put that Milan missile all the way out to its 2-kilometer range, have clear open lines of sight on Argentine positions. You could see them at night using the night sights on the missile launcher, and because it was wire guided, they were able to just drive it right into positions. And the British use of the Milan in the Falklands War actually led to a significant expansion of use of the Milan in that sort of role in other countries. Other people realized, hey, it's not just an anti-tank missile, it's a kind of a general purpose. You need to put some explosive on that target right now and do it accurately. The Argentines also had 90 and 105 millimeter recoilless rifles. They had Browning M2 heavy machine guns. Those were all quite effective. The recoilless rifles aren't hugely accurate, but they were used to good effect by the Argentines. The Argentines had, in some cases, really well dug in positions that allowed them to, or should have allowed them to use those heavy weapons to very good effect. And they did. There were some other problems with Argentine setups, Argentine tactics, and in fact, Les, on his channel over at not Polaris Logistics, that's his company. His channel is Pegasus Tests. We did a video talking about why the British were able to take the Argentine positions as quickly and as easily as they were. I don't want to make light of British casualties because these were hard-fought battles, but having looked at a lot of the battlefields in person, we came away with this attitude of these should have been extremely difficult positions for the British to take, and they ended up, every single Argentine position that was attacked by the British was taken basically the night or the morning after the attack was launched. Not a single British attack was actually repulsed during the conflict. Anyway, there's a video over on Les's channel, or there will be shortly, talking about why that was. So I'll leave that content to him. James also says it seems that artillery and naval gunfire were devastating. The Royal Navy, of course, was the only navy providing naval support to the land troops. Yes, on both sides, artillery support, both mortars and full-on artillery pieces, was quite important. The Argentines had 105 and 155 millimeter guns. The British had a battery of 105 millimeter guns, batteries, as well as 4.5-inch naval gunfire support. And that naval gunfire support was quite relevant to them. There was a lot of really good fire support that came in with naval forward observing officers directing naval gunfire. British field artillery was very accurate and very effective, and those weapons were very important for both sides. Had the British been able to bring more artillery into some of the battles, especially Goose Green at the very beginning, they could have definitely minimized their casualties and had an easier time taking their objectives. Next up, Mac says, would the British have fared better on the Great Yomp if they'd all had M16A1s like the SAS? So first off, yes, SAS and SBS, the Special Air Service and the Special Boat Service, were both present in very significant numbers in the Falklands. They showed up early. They did all sorts of sneaky stuff that even today is much less well publicized than what the Commandos and the Paras did. And a lot of those SAS guys chose to take Armalites, M16s or CAR-15s, instead of their SLRs because the guns were lighter and they were able to carry more ammunition. Now, how would that have made a difference on the Yomp? I don't think it would have at all. The SAS guys, if they're taking an M16, it is in large part because they're going to take a lot more ammunition for it. And I think the total weight of ammo plus rifle pretty much ends up balancing out for both rifles. The guys with SLRs were carrying combat loads of 7.62 NATO, which was a lot less ammo than you could carry if you had a 5.56. So yeah, if they'd all had M16A1s, they all would have had 300 rounds on them instead of 150 rounds on them, or thereabouts, 100 rounds on them. And that would have balanced out the weight, if not actually made for more weight with the lighter caliber rifle. Literary Anarchist asked, is there still a lot of animosity to the Argentinians from the locals on the islands? Yes, there definitely is. This is not a settled issue. Argentina never did give up its claim to sovereignty over the Falklands. They still claim that sovereignty today. There is basically no trade directly between the Falklands and Argentina, which is a shame. Argentina is the closest country. There ought to be trade going back and forth to places like Buenos Aires, but there is not. You basically cannot fly from Argentina to the Falklands. The commercial flights, the two ways to get to the Falklands by air are the British air bridge that leaves out of England, which is about 16 hours total flight, including a stopover on Ascension Island. That's how we actually got down to the islands. You can also fly there via LATAM, which is the Chilean national airline. That's actually how we left. You out through a small town called Punta Arenas at the very southern tip of Chile, and then up to Santiago or anywhere else. Argentina still generally refuses overflights, even for things like serious medical emergencies. So if you need medical care beyond what can be provided by the hospital in Stanley, you go to Uruguay. It's, I think, about a 6-hour flight up to Uruguay. The boat communications, boat link to the Falklands is through Uruguay. It can't go to Chile because of Argentine control of, I believe it's the Beagle Strait at the southern tip of South America. They do not allow British ships to go through it. They don't allow anyone to go through it who's transiting to the Falklands. So yeah, it's unfortunate. There's still definitely animosity there. The Falklands residents are essentially 100% in favor of being British. They do not want to be Argentine. There's still a lot of bad blood from how some of the British were treated during the 1982 war. There's still a bunch of people there who were present during the war. We had the chance to talk to more than a few of them. They really don't like Argentina. Brad and Emily ask, what's the local delicacy and adult beverage? Any favorites on the food and drink that you tried? So the economy of the Falklands today is basically a threefold combination of tourism, sheep, and fishing. So there's not much actual fishing done by the islanders, but they have a maritime control zone that they sell fishing licenses to, and that drives a significant amount of revenue to the island government, but it's other countries coming in, doing fishing, and then taking the fish out. That said, toothfish and local squid are both definitely served on the islands, and they are considered some of the highlights of the local cuisine that you can get. The other big one is lamb. So the main economy on the islands themselves, basically forever, certainly since the 82 war and well before that, is wool. So there are sheep. There are something like 700,000 sheep on the island compared to about 3,500 humans. The sheep are free range all the time. They never come into captivity even for giving birth. They live out on the fields. They just wander around doing sheep things, eating, grazing, and once a year they get shorn for wool. It is quite high quality wool that is sold, and they're also slaughtered for mutton. So there's a tremendous amount of lamb available on the island. There's also some raising of cattle, mostly for beef for local consumption. But I think I saw lamb macaroni and cheese on a menu one place, lamb pies, lamb roast. We spent a night with a local family who made us a gigantic roast that was absolutely delicious. Used to be the islanders all grew substantial vegetable gardens and were pretty much food self-sufficient. Today, a lot of the fresh vegetable sort of things are imported. But, adult beverages. There is a local brewery on the island that makes 5 or 6 different styles of beer. I had a couple of them. They were good. There's also a distillery, Falkland Islands Distilling Company, that makes 2 different expressions of gin. One of them is sort of they're both London dries. One of them is a little more normal. One of them is specifically based on some of the Falkland Islands botanicals that are pretty good. They use tea berry, they use island kelp, which is pretty cool, and also a berry called, I'll put it in a text comment. It just escapes my head off the top of my head. Anyway, so 2 different gins on the island. The beer is really the popular thing. Beyond the mutton and squid and toothfish, the cuisine on the Falklands is completely British. So you can get fish and chips anywhere. You can get pies. You can get a variety of other things, some pasta, curry. Basically every restaurant on the island, and there are like 5 of them, they all serve a variety of curries. It's all totally British. Austin says, what do people do for fun on the Falklands? So it's interesting. The Falklands community is based on one large settlement in Port Stanley that has basically 3,000 people in it. It's the vast majority of the island's population lives in town, and they do in-town things, sort of what you'd expect. There are a number of pubs and bars in town. Horse racing is a thing. There's a racetrack in Stanley. Interestingly, it is not a round oval racetrack. It is a straightaway racetrack, and they've been doing horse racing there like forever. There are, in total, only a few hundred people who live in what's called camp. That is a corruption of the Spanish term campo, for out in the country. Everything outside Stanley is referred to as camp. Out there, they are the professional skill to have is all the stuff around raising sheep, especially sheep shearing. There are some older traditions of parties. One of the things some of the locals told us about was they used to have what are called 2-nighters, where you'd have a 2-night-long party because it took so long to get across the island, to get people together from the various farm settlements that you'd spend a whole day or sometimes 2 days to get to a social gathering. So you'd spend 2 nights there once you got there, because it's kind of a waste to spend a whole lot of travel time going back the first night. Today, there's a road network that has been built largely since the 1982 war. In 82 and before, it was mostly cross-country Land Rover driving, and it was very slow and very bumpy. It took a long time to get anywhere. So the sort of rural get-together parties were long affairs that were particularly special, more so than the ones in town. Internet access, by the way, on the Falklands is terrible. They managed 8 years ago. They signed a sole source contract with a satellite internet company, which is now expensive and incredibly slow. And like a third of the island now have technically illegal Starlink connections in order to get decent internet access. In 2 years, when the contract with the current provider expires, I have no doubt that there's going to be a significant change in internet access on the Falklands. ACC says, what was the oldest small arms design in active service during the war? That would be the #1 Mark III SMLE rifle. The Falkland Islands Defense Force is a small volunteer group that was on the islands, dates back to the 1890s. In the 82 war, they had about 130 members total, although many of them lived out in camp. When the FIDF was mobilized for the invasion, it was done like the night before the invasion, and nobody out in camp had time to actually report in. They had a total of 32 volunteers who reported for duty, plus a few other incidental folks. Like there was one Royal Marine who had been in the Royal Marines in the British contingent on the island for a couple of years, then left the Marines, settled permanently on the Falklands, and when the invasion happened, he immediately re-enlisted and rejoined the Marines. But the FIDF was equipped back in World War II. They got they were using Enfields. World War I, they were issued Enfields. World War II, they got #4 Enfields. By the time of the 82 war, they were using SLRs, British SLRs, but due to a just coincidental quirk of timing, the invasion happened when the British Royal Marine Detachment was being changed. So the Royal Marines had a 1-year detachment on the Falklands, or a 1-year deployment to the Falklands, and it was like 40 guys, but they only kept one set of uniforms and rifles, and they stayed on the island. So the new British Marine detachment would fly down through Uruguay and just switch over with the old detachment, who would go back to the UK. The invasion happened when both the old and new parties were still on the island, which only happened for like 2 or 3 days. And the Marines only had enough SLRs for half of the Marines who were present. So they basically went and raided the FIDF armory, which left the FIDF during the war with only a handful of SLRs. So they dug out the old Enfields. FIDF ended up being stood down before Argentine troops really hit the islands. The governor didn't want them to take a bunch of casualties in an unwinnable defense of the islands. So they didn't do a whole lot during the invasion, but what they didn't do using an assortment of World War I and World War II Enfields. Let's see. Charles says, given the prevalence of various wreckage of military equipment on the island, was there anything that stood out to you or had a particularly interesting story attached to it? None of them really stood out because they all kind of have interesting stories attached to them. It was a small enough conflict that every single piece of wreckage, there's pretty much a story to, even when it gets down to the level of Browning M2 tripods that are still in places on some of the Argentine mountain fortifications. Like we came across one particular recoilless rifle, and it's a well-known chunk of history that this particular rifle was firing harassing fire on one of the neighboring mountains after the British had taken it, and they managed to land a hit on a British Milan missile team just by accident. Like, it was a missile team they couldn't see. It was well over a kilometer away, well beyond the accurate range of a 105 recoilless, and yet they managed to hit it out of luck. And the recoilless is still there, still aimed at that mountain. There are only a couple of helicopter wrecks still in place, and the stories behind them are very well known. A lot of the wreckage has been cleaned up. So, for example, the SAS destroyed 11 aircraft on Pebble Island. All that wreckage is gone. There aren't any Harriers, there aren't any Pucara wrecks, there aren't any Skyhawk or Mirage wrecks left on the island where you can see them easily. There are a couple of Argentine helicopters left, basically, that were destroyed on the ground, and then recoilless rifles and Browning M2 emplacements. ZC says, having seen the terrain fought over in the Falklands, do you think having a full-powered rifle cartridge of the FAL and L1A1 was worth it over an intermediate cartridge? Yes and no. I think the full-power cartridge was absolutely worth it for the squad machine guns. So at that point, the British were not using mini-me's. Both sides, in fact, were using FN mags, called the GPMG, General Purpose Machine Gun by the British, the L7A2. And as those were capable of effective fire from a significantly long range, in part because of their 7.62 NATO cartridge. They definitely were more capable than mini-me's would have been, or other 5.56 light machine guns. As far as the rifles go, it's less significant. The British attacks almost all took place at night, and there wasn't a lot of long-range accurate rifle fire being directed. The British did have more accurate rifle fire than the Argentines, but it was generally at ranges that would have been effective with 5.56 as well. A lot of the combat was relatively close in, especially once rifles were actually being used. Beyond a couple hundred yards, the effective weapons were not rifles at all. They were support weapons. Mortars, Carl Gustavs, Milan missiles, GPMGs, M2 heavy machine guns, that sort of stuff. So the counterpoint is, if they'd had 7.62 machine guns and 5.56 rifles, if the British had, the SA-80, it would have been a disaster on the Falklands. But if they'd had any other 5.56 rifle, it probably wouldn't have made that much difference in the outcome of the combat. Actually, I should say with one potential exception, and that is on a lot of the British attacks, by the end of the attack, units were getting dangerously low on ammunition because there was only so much that they could carry. If they'd had 5.56, they would have had more ammunition to take with them. On the other hand, the British troops absolutely made use of captured Argentine ammo. The Argentine FN magazines and the Argentine 7.62 ammo was completely usable in British rifles. Interestingly, the British FAL magazines are not compatible with the Argentine rifles. Inch pattern mags will not run in metric guns because of the size of the locking lugs on the magazine, but metric mags, like the Argentines had, will run in inch pattern guns, and the British definitely took advantage of that one-way compatibility. Edmund says, have the penguins and sheep learned to avoid the minefields, and is there active demining still happening? The Argentines did in fact lay substantial numbers of minefields to channelize British troops into different positions coming into the mountain readouts around Stanley, and to just block access to different areas. They did a lot of mining of what they expected to be British landing beaches. The British took the Argentines a bit by surprise by landing at San Carlos on the far side of the island. The Argentines were expecting landings relatively close to Stanley, so they mined a whole lot of beaches and approachways around there. However, all of the mines have now been removed. The last ones were taken out just 4 or 5 years ago. So there are no mines left. The sheep were generally not at risk. Occasionally, before the demining was complete, occasionally a sheep would step on an anti-personnel mine, and that was a problem for the sheep. But the sheep were not heavy enough to trigger anti-tank mines, so that was never an issue. And apparently the penguins weren't heavy enough to trigger anything. Let's see. Next up, Tom says, describe the way the ranges of various small arms interacted in the Falklands, with rifles, saws, 40mm on the short end, heavy and medium machine guns longer, 20, 30, and 40mm autocannon, and anti-armor, both short and longer range, and mortar the longest. Basically, you have rifle fire, which in theory could have been effective to relatively long range, except it was all done at night. You have machine gun fire, which was effective at relatively longish ranges, both 30 caliber and 50 caliber machine gun fire. The Argentines had 50s. The British didn't have any 50s. There were some 40mm grenades in use, but generally only with SAS, and they were not a substantial element of the fighting. In place of the 40mm, for the sort of 1 to 200 yard engagement distance explosives, the British used M72 Laws. That's a 66mm anti-tank rocket. You can really think of it as a single-shot disposable RPG. Not particularly accurate. There were a lot of, most of the cases seem to have been, they decide to target something with a Law rocket, and it takes 2 or 3 shots before they actually hit it, especially with the wind that is very prevalent in the Falklands. Wind has weird effects on RPGs. A missile will actually divert into the wind because the wind will hit the tail fins, push the fins away from the wind, which causes the rocket to push it, or just aerodynamics to push it into the wind. And a lot of guys, I think, weren't hugely accurate on first round shots with the Laws, but those were good to a couple 100 yards range. Mortars and artillery were very important, and were staged back far enough to be out of direct fire generally. British naval gunfire was very important. Essentially, the key was to have supporting fire from all of these support weapons. You would have supporting fire from mortars and artillery and machine guns to suppress an enemy position. It was then attacked using a combination of fire and movement teams by the British. They would use Laws, Carl Gustavs, and Milan missiles to directly target Argentine heavy weapons emplacements, GPMG emplacements, and Browning M2s and recoilless rifles. For the Argentines, those heavy weapons formed the core of their defensive positions. Once they lost those heavy weapons, they tended to lose the terrain very quickly. As long as they had the heavy weapons firing, and often some of the better Argentine troops were the ones manning the heavy weapons, as long as those guys were able to stand and fight, the Argentines would hold on to their positions. Once the British managed to destroy the heavy weapons, either by very close-in grenades or by supporting fire or explosives, then they could roll up Argentine positions pretty effectively. Michael says, to what extent did the British experience of encountering French Exocet anti-ship missile fire delivered by Argentine jets push navies around the world to develop and adopt CIWS? CIWS in the US is typically the phalanx system. It's close-in weapons system. It is a radar-controlled, very high rate of fire gun that is designed to destroy anti-ship missiles at very close range. It was already being developed. The US had CIWS systems when the war broke out. They were not put onto British ships because the British didn't have CIWS on any of the ships of their task force. It was deemed that it would take too long to retrofit them onto any ships to make them usable in the Falklands War. They had a couple of different types of ship-launched intercept missiles, Sea Dart and Sea Sparrow, I believe, which were somewhat effective. Sea Dart they tried using on Exocets, and it never really quite worked. They did have chaff defenses that they were able to successfully use on a couple of occasions. But absolutely, the Exocet performance did spur, did encourage people to take CIWS ship defense very seriously. Yeah. Also important to note that the French only had 5 air-launched Exocet missiles when the war began. British Mi-6 actually ran a couple very effective operations to prevent Argentina from getting any additional missiles to use. That's like a lot of that stuff really hasn't been declassified or published still, and I'm sure there are some really interesting stories there. The Argentines did also have ship-based Exocets, as did the British Navy, and 2 of those Exocets off a ship were actually transferred to a makeshift ground launcher on East Falkland late in the war, and one of the ships the British lost to Exocets, the Glamorgan, was hit by a missile launched from shore. Could they have defeated those Exocets if they'd had CIWS systems? Yeah, probably. Or at least they'd had a good shot at it that they didn't have with just Sea Darts and chaff. See, David says, what is in place to deter this from happening again? The British Navy and Army are not what they used to be post-Cold War. So in the wake of the war, the British set up a significant military outpost on East Falkland. It is RAF Mount Pleasant, which is, by the way, one of those totally marketing-based names. It is not pleasant. It is a barren, windswept scrub mountain, but it's called Mount Pleasant. Prior to the war, the British had about 40 men of the Royal Marines who did a rotating detachment mission on the island. Those guys put up a hell of a good fight, by the way. And the Battle of Stanley is a really interesting fight when the Argentines first invaded. And I have a video that I have coming about the Battle of Stanley. Afterwards, the British force initially on the islands, I think was a regiment. It is now a reinforced company. They initially based a full squadron of F-4 Phantoms on the island. That is now a single flight of 4 Eurofighter Typhoons that are based on the island, but they absolutely have the logistics capability to have a whole lot more troops and aircraft on the islands. The Argentine military today, while the Royal Navy may not be what it was in '82, the Argentine Air Force and Navy are definitely not what they were in '82 either. Today, the Argentines do not have a fast jet force capable of threatening even just the 4 Typhoons that the British have on the island. The Argentines also don't have an amphibious landing capability that would allow them to launch an attack on the islands again. In theory, that could change, but it would require a significant amount of force building that would be very difficult to keep secret from the British. So there does not seem to be any current immediate prospect of a repeat Argentine landing on the islands, but as I mentioned earlier, tensions remain fairly high with Argentina. Argentina still claims sovereignty over the islands. We won't get into the question of whose sovereignty claim is more legitimate, except to say that really the current modern standard for this sort of sovereignty question is local self-determination. Who do the locals want to be in charge? And we're used to that being the locals want independence. The locals want to be free of any European colonial oversight. In this case, the Falkland Islanders are like more British than the British are. They absolutely want to be British. There have been referendums done in which they vote overwhelmingly, almost unanimously, to remain British. And by that standard, I think to any unbiased, objective observer, the British claim is the correct one here, simply because it's what all of the islanders want for themselves. Oliver says, how do you think an army designed to stop the Red Steamroller adapted in its use of weapons to the very different context of the South Atlantic? Or was 3rd Commando Brigade sufficiently familiar with conditions from its training for its intended role in Norway? Yeah, 3 Commando had been deployed in Norway for a couple months of winter training almost immediately before they were sent to the Falklands. That absolutely helped them. The conditions in Norway are a bit different, but they were in the Falklands during the Falklands winter. It was cold, there was snow, there was ice, there was a lot of rain, it was miserable out. But 3 Commando were in very good physical condition. They were physically fit to a much greater extent than the 5th Infantry guys who came down from the Scots Guards and the Welsh Guards. Part of the reason there was the debacle, the disaster of the Welsh Guards being hit while still on their transports was because they were not physically capable of marching cross-country the way that 3 Commando was. As for them being sort of repurposed, an army designed to fight in Central Europe against Russia instead gets deployed against an Argentine invasion of the Falklands. I don't think there was that much adaptation necessary. The big one that stands out to me is the use of the Milan, which was intended as an anti-tank missile and was repurposed as an anti-bunker missile, basically, and did extremely well in that role. For the troops, I don't think they saw that much difference between fighting the Russians and fighting the Argentines. Tim says, what is the weirdest or most out-of-place weapon you know to have been used in the war? That's kind of an easy one. There were a number of Argentine snipers who had bolt-action rifles. This, by the way, this conflict predates the use of the L96A1. The British snipers, they had some scoped FALs with the Trilux, they had some night vision equipment, and they had L42A1 sniper Enfields. The weirdest one I've heard of, though, is a Chilean or an Argentine sniper who had a 300 Weatherby Magnum bolt action with a big scope on it. I was very skeptical of this story. Like, why 300 Weatherby Mag in a military role seems very weird to me. But sure enough, it was confirmed from multiple sources that that rifle was absolutely there. It's recorded in one of the SAS accounts of the battle, and I actually had a chance to physically look at some of the ammunition taken from that sniper, and it was, in fact, 300 Weatherby Magnum, which is really weird. Leon says, I'd be interested to know if there were any field modifications similar to the L1A1 Bitch as seen in Vietnam, the Australian forces. Was any kit brought out for operations or actions brought out just for actions during the Falklands? I wasn't able to find any real evidence of like hand-modified kit. Remember, this was a relatively quick campaign. There weren't a lot of like field armorer positions with the opportunity to do a lot of custom weapons work in the way that you would have with longer term fighting. The actions on the Falklands were over in a couple of weeks. 74 days total of Argentine occupation of the islands, but the British troops were only on the islands for a couple of weeks. It took them a while to actually get there. Didn't see any real evidence of Argentine weapons modification. And in both cases, I think the officer and NCO corps of the armies would have prevented much of that from happening. As for kit brought out specifically for Falklands operations, the one thing that really kind of comes to mind are the BVs, an articulated Arctic vehicle that the British used that performed really well on Falklands terrain. It was not a combat vehicle, though. It was a logistics vehicle. It was used for transporting supplies. And the sort of thing that wouldn't have been pulled out for a lot of temperate zone use. The British actually, they did deploy Scorpion and Scimitar light tanks, but not in the numbers that they should have. They didn't expect that those vehicles would be able to move effectively in the Falklands. In fact, in a lot of places, they were extremely well suited to the Falklands. So the British should have pulled out more of those, but didn't. Let's see. Secondly, in your opinion, were British vehicles deployed at risk of serious damage? Could deliberate massed rifle fire disable or destroy those vehicles? The Scimitars and Scorpions were pretty effectively defended against rifle fire. Armor piercing might have been able to go through some of the armor on those guys. 50 caliber machine gun fire definitely could. The Argentines did also have a couple places where they had 20 and 35 millimeter anti-aircraft guns that were able to depress and use in a direct fire role. Those would have been really diabolical on the light tanks, but there was never an engagement where they were used. Those were in places like Goose Green and Stanley itself, where either the British didn't have tanks or there wasn't any actual ground fighting. The Argentines did have a batch of French Panhard armored cars, which were they're wheeled vehicles with a 90mm cannon. The British were really concerned about those because those could have made mincemeat out of the British tanks, but those vehicles really weren't easily capable of cross-country travel on the islands, or at least the Argentines didn't think they were and didn't use them in that role. They stayed in Stanley and ultimately didn't really play any role in the fighting. Guido says, what were the more common ranges in engagements back then? Rather beyond the more common 200 and in. I understand it's a cold, windswept place, so wind sounds like to be an issue. Like I've said before, most of the engagements took place at night, where the rifle fire was either accurate because it was relatively close, or it was just suppressive fire. You know, in some cases, literally just hold the gun up over your head and drop some rounds to try and keep the enemy's head down, or firing at muzzle flashes where wind wasn't really an issue because there was no accurate long-ranged rifle fire during the day. I think we covered that one pretty well already. HMS Platypus says, with the use of trenches and bayonets during the conflict and the return of trench fighting in places like Ukraine today, do you feel the bayonet and bayonet fighting still has a place on the modern battlefield? I think there's an argument to be made for it. The British absolutely used bayonets. There was hand-to-hand bayonet fighting in the Falklands, again, because a lot of this was done at night. There were some places where the British were able to infiltrate into Argentine positions before the Argentines knew they were there. There were some places where the British accidentally infiltrated past Argentine positions and then ended up in very close combat with troops both ahead and behind them. Bayonets were used. There were some accounts of machine gun positions being taken at bayonet point. And yeah, we do see trench fighting in Ukraine, and if I was going to go into combat today, the idea of having a bayonet is not the worst thing out there. Let me put it this way. I think I would rather have a bayonet and some extra rifle ammo than a rifle without a bayonet and a pistol on me. New Englander asks, do the islands have any unique kit or unique considerations for the armed forces there if a conflict ever arose, specifically things the rest of the UK armed forces don't typically have? Yes and no. So the British Army troops who are currently stationed there have just standard British Army equipment. They all have SA-80A2s, or L-85A2s, and regular British Army gear. The Falkland Islands Defense Force is not an element of the British military. It is directly funded and controlled by the Falkland Islands government, which is an independent, self-determining government that only cedes its foreign policy and primarily foreign policy decisions to the UK. The FIDF, when they got rid of their SLRs, they replaced them with Steyr AUGs, which is kind of interesting, and they had AUGs with both LCAN and SUSAT sights, which are really not quite totally unique, but pretty darn close to unique. I actually have a video that I did with the FIDF on their AUGs. That video will be coming out at some point here. So I'll leave the discussion of the AUGs to that video. FIDF is also a pretty darn well-equipped force. It's very small. Its role is basically that of reconnaissance, observation, and providing local knowledge and scouting and advice to the British Army detachment should conflict ever happen again in the Falklands. They have really good cold weather gear, inclement weather gear, vehicles. Like the FIDF is kitted out, which is a bit unusual. It's a fully volunteer force. But yeah, they've got really good stuff. Not so much weapons that are unique, but they have really good gear for their mission. Howard says, what, if anything, is the general American view of the Falklands War and its diplomatic fallout for US-UK relations? I don't think Americans have that much recognition of the Falklands War. I think a lot of people remember it vaguely as something from the 80s, if they know about it at all. I don't think there's really any American consideration of the diplomatic fallout. During the war, the US was in friendly relations with both the UK and Argentina, but when push came to shove, the US government chose to aid the British with a bunch of things. US supply of AIM-9L Sidewinders was a critical element in the the British air victories in the Falklands. The US supplied a bunch of other stuff. Had the British lost an aircraft carrier to Exocets, the US was willing to loan them the USS Iwo Jima to use for air cover. But today, no one really, like, there's no US diplomatic issue with the Argentines in the general population. I don't know if there is within government circles, but yeah, the US doesn't really know or care about the Falklands War these days. James has, this is a third James, has a couple of questions. First, which way did you yomp, north route or south route? We took the north route. We started at Port San Carlos. We basically followed the route of 4-5 Commando. We went to Douglas, then to Teal Inlet, then to Estancia, and then past Two Sisters and Mount Longdon into Stanley. Number two, did you get to Ajax Bay or the British military cemetery at San Carlos? We didn't get to the military cemetery. We saw Ajax Bay. The hospital there is no longer standing. It was originally like it was set up as basically a butchering and refrigeration plant for sheep that had been long abandoned by the time the war happened. The British took over the building and used it as a military hospital. They called it the Red and Green, was it Red and Green Life Machine? Red and green because the Paras had red berets, the Marines had green berets. One of the cool things about the Ajax Bay Hospital in this conflict is that literally every single person who arrived at Ajax Bay alive survived. There were guys who got wounded and died before they got to the hospital, but both Argentine captured troops and British troops, if you made it alive to Ajax Bay, you survived, which is a really good record. Fourth, what is the Falklands like today, and what was the difference with what you expected? Honestly, I didn't really know what to expect. Didn't have a lot of preconceived notions in mind, so I can't really answer that one. Falklands today, the sheep economy is in a bit of decline. Sheep prices, wool prices are down from what they used to be, which is concerning to the people who live out in camp, who are engaged in sheep farming. The town of Stanley has roughly tripled in size since the war. It's a lot bigger. There's a lot more stuff going on. There's a lot more tourism now than there was during the war because they have built up an inter-island road network extensively since the war. You can actually drive all around the island today on roads, which is a huge improvement from the wartime situation where essentially there were a couple of roads, but basically everything was cross-country. That's the biggest change, I think, in the islands. Alex said, having walked the ground, how do you feel the war would play out today with modern technology, assuming the same failures of diplomacy and the British task force making it to the islands in a pretty similar manner and in similar numbers? I think generally the war would happen, most things would be about the same today. Most of the weapons aren't that much different today. Drones are a huge game changer in the Falklands. The FIDF is particularly concerned about learning to work with and adapt to new drone technology that we see coming out of Ukraine. There are all sorts of opportunities. Like, there's no cover in the Falklands. Loitering munition drones would be a very, very relevant and important aspect of the fighting. The British would be able to use drones to take out Argentine positions. The Argentines would have been able to use drones to do things like attack the British troops while they were marching cross-country. Drone attacks on the British task force would be huge, and it's hard to even guess how all of those things would interact and how they would impact the overall war. But drones would be a massive game changer to the Falklands. Other than that, satellite photography, satellite reconnaissance would make things easier for both sides, locating the enemy. But drones would be the big thing. And our last one is from Jeff, who says there are stories of British soldiers picking up Argentine FALs because they were full auto. Did that actually happen? It definitely did happen. There are a number of soldiers' accounts of it happening, but probably more limited than people might think. The British troops were generally very well trained and very effective, and they were not putting the rifles on, they didn't need a rifle in full auto. They had their rifles, they were good guns. Semi-auto is what they were going to be primarily using anyway. The places where they picked up Argentine rifles would most likely have been when they had dug-in emplacements, because the British did spend periods of time in different places before moving out on attacks. You could definitely see British troops like grabbing an Argentine rifle to have stashed at their foxhole or defensive position. You know, if you need full auto, you know, covering fire kind of thing, well, you got an Argentine extra rifle there to use as a backup, or to use as a first weapon, dump a magazine from it and then toss it and use your own rifle. In terms of using them on the attack, is it really more effective to dump a magazine from a full auto Argentine rifle and then have to unsling and access your own rifle instead of using rapid semi-auto fire and then just reloading your own rifle? The British NCO Corps would probably not have looked all that kindly on using enemy weapons in that way. There were some places where enemy machine guns and heavy weapons were turned around when British took those emplacements. They turned around and used to what effect they could, basically until the immediately available ammunition was used up and then they were ditched. However, as I said earlier, the British absolutely made use of Argentine ammo because it was all compatible with their own guns. And guys who are running low on ammo absolutely picked up Argentine stocks to use. Also Argentine rations. Some of these battles, the British fighting forward ended up on, you know, having taken positions that they had to stay on for a little bit of time before they were able to move out or be replaced. And they ran low on their own rations since they were attacking and basically just fighting load. And yeah, they did definitely grab some Argentine food supplies when they had the opportunity. Of course, the Argentines had a continuous problem that the troops in the hill fortifications didn't get as much food as they really should have. Argentine logistics were not very good in keeping those guys supplied. So oftentimes there wasn't going to be a whole lot in frontline positions for the British to find and use. So that's all of the questions that I received here. Thank you very much to all of you guys for providing those questions. There were some really good ones in there. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. As I said at the beginning, I'm going to be doing Q&As on a regular basis again, once a month probably. So if you're interested in getting your own questions into those, head on over to Patreon, sign up, and join in helping support Forgotten Weapons. And when I'm setting up the Q&As, I will post a question to patrons asking for questions. Thanks for watching.